Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Amit for taking out the time and being here for the first of the Columbia Journal of Asia speaker series, which we are so excited to be launching this evening. The plan for today is that we will just share a few more words about the journal and the speaker series, and then about Amit. He will then be presenting Sojourn, his newest book that also there are some flyers for at the back. So if anyone hasn't had a chance already, feel free to pick one up on your way out. We will have a reading from the book by Amit, and then have some time for both moderated discussion with the editors of the Asia Journal, and then also time for open Q&A for both our Zoom participants and our in-person participants as well.
I think we'll start by introducing our journal and also ourselves. My name is Suwan.
I'm Rinalini.
And the two of us are undergraduates at Columbia University, serving as the co-editors-in-chief of the newly launched Columbia Journal of Asia. We launched this journal at the start of 2022, this year, and published our first issue this April, working in partnership with Columbia Libraries, faculty in the departments of History, Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies, East Asian Studies, and Gender Studies, graduate peer reviewers from Columbia, Yale, Harvard, NYU, and other peer schools, as well as a team of passionate and committed undergraduate editors from Columbia University and Barnard College. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce Jacqueline Purna. Jacqueline is our managing editor, and Purna is our director of peer review, and we worked as a team to start this speaker series. So, thanks to them. And okay, so CJA is, as of now, the first and the only undergraduate publication at Columbia centered on Asia and the Asian diaspora, publishing academic and creative pieces from undergraduate students across the world, ranging from the United States to Britain, India, Singapore, Korea, Italy, and elsewhere. Our aim is to create a space that centers Asian narrative, addressing the urgent need for meaningful representations of and discussions about Asia and the Asian diaspora at universities such as our own. In the spirit, we are thrilled to be launching our fall 2022 speaker series tonight through a conversation with novelist, literary critic, and musician Amit Chaudhuri. The series is intended to foster community and spark dialogue about the role of Asian narrative.
It's okay, I might still be awake.
About to happen.
This is, of course,
for a hybrid
event.
These are people.
There we go. Okay. All good. Yes.
The series is intended to foster community and spark dialogue about the role of Asian narratives and diasporas in academic and artistic circles. And we could not have thought of a more fitting beginning to the series than to host Amit with us here today.
So just a few words about Amit, who, again, we are just so lucky to have you here. And I was very fortunate to be introduced to Amit through Professor Boynton this summer. Amit is an award-winning novelist, essayist, poet, and musician, dividing his time between Calcutta and Oxford. So we're fortunate to have you in New York for these days that you're here. He's the author of 8 other fictional novels, 3 collections of poetry, and 5 works of nonfiction, including The Origins of Dislike, a collection of critical essays, and Finding the Raga, an exploration of Hindustani classical music. Amit is also a singer in the North Indian classical tradition, performing several classical and experimental pieces, and the founder of a series of annual symposiums entitled Literary Activism, which bring together writers, academics, and artists. Amit is a fellow in the Royal Society of Literature, and honorary fellow at Balliol College at Oxford and at the Modern Languages Association, and a recipient of numerous literary awards, including the inaugural Infosys Prize, the Sahitya Academy Award, and the James Tate Black Award. So Amit, welcome, and thank you for being here. We wanted to hand the floor over to you to talk a bit more about Sojourn and read an excerpt from the book, and then we'll move into more conversation and Q&A about the book and about your work.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I was very interested and impressed by the account that Mrinalini gave me of the journal, and I read the manifesto. Is it the manifesto? Like a kind of
nice word for it. Yeah, but we put mission statement, but manifesto
mission
sounds
statement.
more.
Mission statement. So
Yeah.
I sort of really it kind of struck a chord with me, and I was happy to have those conversations with you, which were related to some of the things that you're trying to explore with your journal. And Sojourn, the fact that, so we were planning to have a chat about some of follow up on our conversations. The novel comes out now is a coincidence, and I'm glad it's kind of been integrated into this, into our conversation tonight. But it certainly wasn't, at the beginning in any way central to it. So it's not meant, this is not meant to be a book launch, but so we try to save it from being a plug for a book. But
We might plug the books. I mean, it's a fantastic book, and we like, yeah,
thank you so
yeah,
much.
just
Thank you.
we're excited. But yes, absolutely.
So I'm just, it is really a very short book. I mean, when I say that, I say it as a person who's written short books all his life. And this is the shortest. I mean, I'm saying it's a short book. So, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my kind of experiences to do with writing short books and looking for them and reading them, looking for them in the world. But we can come to that later if we want to. So the reason I'm saying this is any bit that I read out threatens to become, half the book or a quarter of it. So I hope that there's enough left for you to read. I hope this isn't too long, because the book is arranged in such a way, I'm lulled into thinking that, it's so short, anything I read is going to be short, but it might go on. Let me give you the background. A man visits, an academic visits Berlin in 2005. He is from an Indian background, he is Indian, but that detail is not really central to the story, in the sense that it's not about an Indian's experience of Berlin. That's not what it is. That doesn't mean that his being Indian isn't important, because his being Indian and belonging to that generation, which coincidentally is my generation, is kind of key to the fact that he was formed by the Cold War, as the world was. A period in history which, for those who were growing up at the time, seemed to be eternal. I mean, no one thought that the Berlin Wall would fall. So he's arrived at a time when the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall is still there. It's a kind of, it exists in the air, and the world it has then left behind, and the peculiar thing of the East having become accessible, that still feels peculiar. So these encounters between West Berlin, where he lives, where during this time as a visiting professor or a guest professor, and his trips to the East mean something in terms of his own history. And it's his own history, which I'm not kind of defining through Indianness, that I'm looking at over here, and the peculiar sense of familiarity and a sense of homecoming that he feels in Berlin for whatever reason. And he's thinking to himself, this isn't a place I really know, it isn't part of my history. Why do I feel this sense of recognition? So that's the other thing I want to kind of explore. Now, he has two guides in the book, this narrator, who is unnamed, not intentionally unnamed, but as it turns out unnamed. One is called Fakhrul Haq, and he is a Bangladeshi poet in exile who was kicked out of his country in the 70s because he, insulted Allah in one of his poems. And the other is Birgit, who is a woman, he hangs out with. But there's also Geeta Roy, who will turn up in this particular section, who is an academic and who makes kind of, who gets acquainted with him, and she and her husband are now going to feature in this bit I'm going to read out. This bit is when Fakhrul, who comes and goes, has gone. So this bit is about when he's gone. He's extremely friendly. He comes, he shows him around Berlin, and then he disappears and is inaccessible. So this is one of those inaccessible kind of periods. And what else do I need to tell you? I'm going to read out, if this doesn't go on for too long, a bit in which I'll be reading out bits in German, a language I don't know. So, I'll be reading it out in my own way, my own accent, phonetically, treating the words as if they were English, but, as if I can't understand them. So anyway, so forgive me that, but this is part of what the book is. Okay. Then began my Fakhrul-less days. He wouldn't pick up calls. I didn't resent his silence. He'd always felt to me the type who'd retreat unannounced. He was also the sort who'd reappear, obeying some directive. One afternoon, Geeta Roy took me out for lunch and we entered a verdant neighborhood, and driving past, she said, "That's Gunter Grass's house." So I should have also added, Fakhrul was brought from Calcutta, where he'd been moved to from Bangladesh after being kicked out from Bangladesh to Germany by Gunter Grass, who encountered him there. That's Gunter Grass's house. I may be wrong, but I think it was pale green. Or it could be my memories tricking me, and his name, who knows, may have something to do with it. But it wasn't a grassy green. There was just a hint of color. He doesn't live there now, she said, but he did for years. I knew the house already because these years was the time that Fakhrul had lived with grass. They'd fallen out because he found he was washing too many dishes and writing too little poetry. Grass too had had enough to do by then with Fakhrul, the tall tales, the exaggerated enthusiasms. Here, as we drove past, Fakhrul's absence in the last fortnight intersected with Grass's departure from his house for a new one, and with Fakhrul's double loss of habitation, not to mention his leech-like optimism and tenacity. Alone, I went to Peek and Kloppenberg for a winter jacket. The stores are lit like cathedrals in November, but the crowds vying to get in are like droves around temples, intemperate, slightly frivolous. On the third floor, I found an oasis among rows of winter wear. Standing in front of a slanted mirror, I tried a jacket that zipped right to my chin, though I wasn't sure if it fit. "This one's fetching," said a man going past. From his appearance, I realized after a second he was Pakistani. I like running into Pakistanis abroad. It's like encountering a race of human beings that has so much more finesse than you could have. "You don't think I need a size smaller?" I was seeking him out, though I was still drawn to the mirror. "No," he said, further off now. "It's just right." You can hear me at the back clearly. Petra, now I'm talking about this guy teaches a class a week. Petra used to attend these classes. Petra dropped out of my class. Its composition was changing. People alighted, got off. As on a raft, a ragged bunch remained, an Israeli student with an American accent, a stocky woman, the kind that's always shopping for groceries, 2 Indian students from Delhi, a German TA who circulated photocopies, some others whom I wasn't certain of having seen before. No one volunteered an opinion. The water surrounding the raft lay becalmed. As at a departmental do, Geeta Roy told me German students like to defer to authority. Her implication was that the deference was historical, but it made life on the raft difficult because I held forth but wasn't authoritative. I wanted to hear their shaky English. German students could subsist like this for years, I had heard. "You poor man," said Geeta. She commiserated with me for having to steer the seminar and for living in Dahlem, which is a kind of boring American created area in West Berlin. I got the department to procure a DVD player for me. "I need to watch TV," I said. "I'm tired of news on the BBC." In the apartment, I led a life of outward boredom, but never completely disconnected from the edges. Grunewald. Part of me was susceptible to what was outside the pavement and beyond the motorway. Geeta and her husband drove up to my place with gifts, 2 DVDs. One was Rope. I'd said I didn't want to watch new films. The other was a wildlife documentary which she insisted would soothe and educate me. We got into the car. We drove, where else? East. "We'll show you a bit of the city," Geeta said from the back, ebullient. "Tell me," I was peering into the rearview mirror, "what exactly is Heimat?" "It's a kind of soap opera," said Geeta. "The Germans love it." I heard tolerant dismissal in her voice. Michael, a hefty newspaperman, dapper but no nonsense, smiled at the mention of the Germans. I watched a few episodes, I said. I dip in and out. Do you know German? Not a word. I added, it doesn't matter. I only watch bits of episodes as you might look out of a window. I haven't seen it in years, muttered Michael, slowing down at a traffic light. It doesn't seem like a soap opera, I said, turning to Geeta despite the seatbelt's restraint. Not like a British or American one, you know, EastEnders, The Bold and the Beautiful. No, it was more a national autobiography, if there's such a thing. Only the Germans would have used such a device, that is, have their nation recount its memories of growing older in a soap opera. Slip in what's intimate in a way that's unworthy of attention. The Brandenburg Gate came up, lit, resplendent, a sovereign without purpose. But what did they do in the East? I asked. Do? I mean, every day. Michael told me about the queues, the dreadful food in restaurants, the speaking in whispers behind closed doors. But they must have been happy sometime. Each fact brought up an image of streets, women walking with determination. But something was missing. No human can be unhappy without interruption. I think they used to tell each other stories, said Geeta from the back. That's what I've heard, that they'd get together in a room and recount family stories to keep their spirits up. They'd also sing to each other in the rooms and dance. Maybe I'd misused the word happy. I hadn't meant high spirits or laughter. I had something basic in mind, the release from the awareness of who or where you are, which comes to us a few times a day. To even be in a state when the thought, I'm in East Berlin in 1983, hasn't formed when consciousness is undecided. It was in imagining that blankness that I felt I could enter the GDR. In reliving the distraction from what's at hand, I became one with it for a few moments. I think I should stop. I'd love to read the part where I mangle the German, but you know, it'll come later. So I'm resisting the temptation to go on. Yeah.
You're leaving us on a good lead for people who want to pick up afterwards with the book.
Thank you so much, Amit. Sojourn is actually deeply resonated with both of us. We
So glad to hear that.
Yeah, we had the privilege of reading it, and as we are certain it will for audience members resonate with all of you. And it resonated with us, particularly with regard to how the text engages with memory, which is actually a word that you used in the excerpt you just read out, as well as fragmentation, travel, of course, displacement, and otherness. So before we break into Q&A and accept questions from all of our in-person attendees as well as on Zoom, we wanted to pose a few questions of our own, if that's all right. So turning firstly to the sense of displacement, this novel's very title suggests the journey that is short-lived with a fixed terminus. We were interested in how the novel, in this sense, engages with the genre of travel literature that we have encountered at Columbia and elsewhere, which has a long history of privileging the voice of European voyagers in Asia, Africa, the indigenous Americas, critiquing these non-Western societies from the outside. Here, the gaze is reversed. We have an Indian narrator experiencing Berlin from the outside, and arriving at a visiting professorship, he seems to be promised privileged access to Berlin, to its history, its culture, and its elite intellectual circles. And yet, from early on, to fill everybody in who hasn't read the beginning of the novel, his experiences seem to complicate and perhaps also run contrary to the expectations of this position. He's not originally given the designated accommodations for his professorship, later told that the university would think he lives in a hut from, quote, where he comes from, excuse me. Upon meeting a Canadian colleague, he tasked himself in a subordinating position, writing that the colleague was, quote, here to do proper research, unlike me, an ornament to an internationalism initiative. So after all of this kind of prefacing and contextualization, how does your narrator make sense of his outsider status within Berlin, vis-a-vis his engagement with various displaced communities such as German Jews, Turkish immigrants, and other members of the South Asian diaspora?
Right. So, you know, was thinking about what you were saying as you were saying it, because when you sent me the question earlier, but I just looked at it. I didn't really think about it. I thought it was a good question, but I didn't think about what I should say in response. But various thoughts were coming to my head because I was thinking, is Sojourn? It's the one book by me that you've read, But I was thinking to myself, is it so different from the other books I've written? What are the kind of connections with the other books? And so I'll begin there. I mean, in the sense that all the books are about sojourns, most of them, all the books I've written, I think maybe except for one, The Immortals. So by which I mean that, that they're all about a visit. All the books are about a visit. And the visit allows me, so I'm trying to think, what is a travelogue like? We can come back to that later. But a visit allows me to sort of transplant a person from a particular place to another place. But so in the first novel that I wrote, A Stranger's Blemishes, this person is a 10-year-old boy who goes from Bombay to Calcutta to his uncle's house to visit his cousins and his uncle for a period of time during the summer holidays. And basically he's been yearning to go, and he arrives there and he is there. What that entails is basically an embrace of free time, and an embrace of the ordinary, which during the visit seems exciting and strange. So maybe other things have changed. He is growing up in a 12th story, and then maybe later on he moves to a 25th story apartment in Bombay. These things are mentioned in a couple of sentences. This is a 3-storied house that he visits in Calcutta. So it allows him access to the street and to the view of other houses opposite, something which he can't get from the 25th story. And it also allows him to makes sounds available to him in a way that are not on the 25th story or 12th story, which basically means sounds are what things make that are often mostly beyond your range of vision. Only some of the sounds you hear are from things you can see. A lot of the sounds you hear through the day are from things you don't see, outside your field of vision. So this is what's happening during his visit. He is being introduced to things he knows, but which are unknown. So the visit is not in the sense of a fantastical kind of visit or a travelogue, a kind of foray into the unknown. It's a foray into the known, but the known begins to have greater potential and seems to kind of be worth reinvestigating in this new location in a way that it isn't in the original location. It's not worth investigating over there, the known. In this new location. So the visit creates the possibility of reinvestigating the known. And in a sense, I'm looking at the known over here. I'm looking at the unknown, but I'm very deeply interested in the known, and what comprises it. So, and I'm sort of, as I said, he feels a sense of homecoming here, this narrator. And I think the structure of the visit, which I've repeated without intending to again and again, and this whole question of what's home and what's not kind of allows me to explore those questions in the sense that that first novel, for instance, I describe a particular kind of neighborhood, particular kinds of windows, terraces, houses. And people said to me, wonderful description of North Calcutta, which is the old town. So can be categorized in Calcutta as the old town, definitely. And I said, but this isn't North Calcutta, it's South Calcutta. And then they would say, which part of South Calcutta did you have in mind? And I said, Bhawanipur. And they said, oh, of course, Bhawanipur is the North Calcutta of the South. So, what I'm saying is that I'm drawn to this kind of convergence of foreignness and the familiar, and have been right from the beginning. So I'm just connecting this book to something that's been an ongoing preoccupation, except that over here it's complicated by other things, like the fact that we are formed by a particular, we, when I say we, yeah, all of us, even those who were born after the wall came down, are formed, who have anything to do with the 20th century by a particular kind of history, which we have no language for. We really have put it to one side. We don't have any language for it, and yet it affected us. Just the one last thing I'd like to say in connection with your question, but also the approach I took in various books, which might be connected to this, is to is not to go for not just story, but a kind of retelling of an experience. So into that fits the idea that, I'm not going to be writing about an Indian person visiting Berlin. That in itself constructs itself as a telling of a particular kind, or a retelling of a particular kind. So similarly with the Strangers Address, I thought, I'm not going to be writing about a 10-year-old boy, or based on my kind of memories of, it's not going to be about what it was like to be a 10-year-old in 1970, whatever, visiting Calcutta. It's going to be about the now, which is at every moment an unknown kind of category. And so I kind of jettisoned the ethos of telling, of recounting, if not telling, recounting. And that I think I've kind of revisited from novel to novel, including this one. So that also makes for a particular approach in terms of how you decide to let things unfold, and what bit of the representational you choose, or do you choose representing as a mode, and I don't.
I think that actually leads us very directly into the next thing we wanted to ask you about, which I think both relates to your ideas on kind of what it means to write sort of a novel without sort of committing to representation, kind of the sense that we often come to expect from the genre, but also specifically with regard to the book's frequent references to historical Berlin, and also to just like periods, for instance, before the fall of the wall, or even during kind of the Nazi regime, which kind of are almost like interspersed within kind of moments that seem to be this narrator's everyday life. And in that sense, we felt in reading it that the work really disrupts the reader's sense of temporality and the expectation of there being some kind of a linear narrative in many ways. One being this kind of fragmented voice of the narrator that is interspersed, as we're saying, with these kind of frequent historical references that weave together kind of past and present experiences of the space. But also even the noticeable kind of sparseness of words on the page as we kind of progress through the novel, we found especially by the very end, we were struck by. And it seems like there are moments when time is slowing down, almost stopping completely, and then suddenly picks up pace again without warning, running contrary to any expectation of a story that unfolds at a very kind of predictable or steady pace, perhaps. Now, you had written elsewhere, and this is where I'm hoping we can also talk about some of your other kind of scholarship and writings. You've been written about kind of the significance of hiatus in a work of literature. And you have written about this with regard to, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita, and in your engagement with Indian antiquity more broadly, about how there can be surprisingly full, I think is the phrase I remember you're using somewhere, a literary hiatus that is surprisingly full, that where you pause in a way and kind of break up this linear chronology of time, and get some kind of richness out of this moment of hiatus. And so what we were curious about was if you could maybe speak more to that idea, but also specifically to how that shapes the way you engage with temporality in writing Sojourn or your other works as well, and how you approach writing a novel.
Right. Hiatus is a nice word because it's a neutral word. In fact, it doesn't have any kind of a symbolic sort of nihilistic or negative connotations. In a way that fragment can have two different meanings: disjuncture, emptiness, can have different interpretations, and these are words that stand in a in a complicated, in a complicated place in language and in history. So you're especially given the kind of legacies of the Enlightenment, you're never sure how to interpret them. So yeah, I am sort of interested in the hiatus, interested in the energy of the hiatus, interested in the fullness and the energy of what might seem to be nothing, you know. And I'm unconcerned about the fact that I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned about it, but as a creative practitioner, I'm unconcerned about the fact that that hiatus, emptiness, etc., might be misinterpreted to have some sort of symbolic, register where it kind of connotes breakdown or the negative or trauma even. So that I think modernism throws out that challenge, that it will not be contained by this allegory to do with fragmentation as trauma or as breakdown, but is constantly interpreted in those terms. And yet we return again and again to modernism, not because we want to learn more about breakdown, but because we feel buoyant when we encounter it. And that's because it comes from a particular point in history where maybe those sort of definitions which belong to Enlightenment binaries to do with, action, inaction, emptiness, fullness, positive, negative, are kind of at that point of time breaking down, and partly through the discovery in the West, but worldwide, of other traditions which are not as much curtailed or defined by those binaries, where hiatus and fragment don't have those predictable meanings that they do after the Enlightenment in the West. So the kind of moment of encountering those other forms of representation or non-representation and those modes of thought which they are part of in the late 18th and 19th century leads to eventually the kind of liberation that we encounter when we encounter modernism, where the idea of the fragment, for instance, will not be domesticated by that binary, and that gives us great sense of liberation, and it kind of buoys us up when we read these texts, and then we become morosely obedient, and then we interpret according to certain certain niceties to do with those particular binaries. As a writer, I have, the sense of liberation I feel is the liberation of not wanting to be and not being sort of in my head or practice constrained by those binaries, and to always be delighting, and which doesn't mean that I'm sort of happy and smiling when writing or rereading my work. It's an agonizing process, but to always be delighting in for it to be a kind of way of looking at this experience we call joy, or in Indian kind of in the lexicon it's called anand or ananda, which is which is also at a certain point of time conflated, I think, in Indian thought with emptiness and with disinterestedness. It's a very odd thing for us to now understand, but it's a pervasive kind of shift in India. I think it kind of shifts things here too and creates these really quite anomalous texts, which we now take to be canonical texts, which are not kind of typical of, if one were to kind of generalize and come up with a term like Western civilization, they're not really typical of Western civilization at all. They're ill-fitting, they're misfits. They happened. I find a connection with them as I do with things they found a connection with, which are some of the older texts coming from my part of the world, maybe, where people are pursuing that particular shift. Probably this means nothing to people who haven't read some of the other stuff that I've been writing, but you know, I hope it kind of at least means a tiny bit enough for you to kind of look into.
And I'm thinking that the specific example you've been giving of the term happiness anand, I mean, I'm curious about how that even might frame the way we think of the excerpt that you just read,
Exactly.
right? And what it meant to be. You were asking, your narrator asked this question, like, were they happy?
Happy.
Right?
This
Yeah.
word happy,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's an interesting
Curious,
word.
yeah. I mean, I remember being struck by that section while reading it, that he asked that question. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So because he goes with these people, with this couple to East Berlin, and of course he's getting the usual story. It was dreadful, you know, and you know, a lot of that, maybe whatever that word means, true, you know. But we're getting that story, and then you think that the person thinks, but that doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture when people aren't conscious of themselves. And it is impossible for people not to be that, you know. So how can we capture a time and a place where we are unable to capture the unconscious, not in the Freudian sense, but in a very basic daily sense that is accessed by, let's say, literature and cinema and other kinds of thought, and I'm referring to them as modes of thinking. How can we, then we have to reduce to representation. You know, we are representing the East. And in this representation of the East, they are unhappy, but we are not looking at the moments where they are distracted. If we are not looking at the moments when they're distracted, then, you know, we kind of, whether it's them we are representing ourselves, if we are not looking at when we are distracted, we are unable to kind of get outside of representing ourselves or them. So the person says, but they can't have been, no human can be unhappy without interruption. And you know, this novel got a very nice review in the Wall Street Journal, but this sentence was misquoted as no human being can be happy without interruption, which is a more kind of expected thing, that no one can be happy without interruption. But so one is overturning that over here in order to access a history and the way we think about that history. No human being can be unhappy without interruption. This is what, you know, I think Teju Cole or somebody said about the idea of first world problems. What are they? You know, what does that rubric or definition mean? So it's because then you move again into representation of Africa, where they have a set of problems by which you can recognize them. You're not moving beyond that into their sense of delight, which is distraction. It's punitive to say and puritanical to say that the East was completely devoid of that dimension because it's not possible. It's just not possible. In my kind of, so to go back to that word, happiness and emptiness, because distraction is emptiness, daydreaming is emptiness. You're vacant, in vacant or in pensive mood, as Wordsworth said. Vacant, pensive. How does he make that correlation? Something has happened by the time he's writing that poem for him to make that correlation in vacant or, not in vacant and, vacant or in pensive mood. Pensive is vacant. How? You know, it wouldn't have occurred to somebody 100 years prior to Wordsworth. So something is going on over there. And similarly, emptiness, distraction. So this shifts in history. The way we use language. I was saying to somebody yesterday or day before yesterday about the word for happiness in Bangla, Hindi, sukh. And I think when I was growing up, I always thought sukh was peace. Only lately did I become aware of the fact that it actually means happiness. Because the way it's used in bhakti poetry, mujhe bahut mohe sukh aave, when Krishna comes back to Radha, sukh. Happiness didn't seem to be able to contain that sense of being that was then being referred to. So I always subconsciously thought the way sukh is being used by my parents, by people around me, by people who work at our place, just the way I overhear it, I just misinterpreted it as peace, as shanti. Later on, I found it meant happiness. When I was saying this to my wife, I said, it's strange how I thought sukh meant not happiness, but peace, which is a form of vacancy, which is a form of pieces. Shanti is a key word in that history, a word with which Eliot ends the wasteland. So shanti, shanti, shanti. So is a key word in the Upanishads. So it's a form of thought, peace, emptiness, what we usually think of as negative, vacancy. So I think it's strange. I was saying to my wife that, I thought that sukh meant peace. And my daughter was overhearing us, and she generally is completely uninterested in what we say, or in fact, sometimes a little hostile as well. But she said, "Oh, isn't that what it means?" Because she thought it was peace as well. So what I'm talking about is a shift, a historic shift that leads to subconscious ways in which we understand and use language, even languages which we are familiar with, that they have registers. Which we haven't completely explored. And those registers are part of shifts in history, away from happiness to vacancy.
We have one final question that we've prepared. You talked a lot about this agonizing creative process. On the one hand, it's a piece of fiction and creatively imagined. On the other hand, it was not lost on us that you lived in Berlin yourself in 2005 as a visiting academic, as is the character. So could you speak to the relationship between narrator and author, imagination and memory, and what it is that also made you uncover, or perhaps in some ways return to this story almost 20 years later after your own experience in Berlin?
So, I had this thought about this man who encounters Berlin and feels as if he knows it deeply. He feels, he recognizes it. Yeah, and I have to say, in connection to myself, this whole business of recognition doesn't have to do with, where you're from or which part of the world you're in when you recognize something. You might feel alienated. So I feel alienated in certain parts of Dubai. I have to go looking for bits of Dubai where I don't feel alienated, and then something comes to life for me. So that topography is not completely determined by saying I'm Indian. Similarly, Geneva bores me, but there are certain streets in Geneva which I think, so this is Geneva too. And Muriel Sparks says the same thing, recounting Edinburgh and the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Miss Jean Brodie takes the schoolgirls for a walk through the old town, And then the narrator says, well, if because the old town is so strange. So the narrator says, well, there must have been many Edinburghs, and just as there were many 1930s. So you know, what was it? What was the question?
Well, that was fascinating in and of
Yeah, I
itself.
think-
We were thinking about the relationship between your own experience as a visiting academic.
So yeah, I wanted to investigate
Hmm.
this recurrent thing, which, you know, just makes nonsense of the fact that, well, this is an Eastern city, this city, this is that. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't do any kind of justice to our histories. And I kind of just wanted to, so now the person becomes absorbed. So he's in Berlin, the sense of recognition, homecoming, means that from moment to moment, he's looking at things, he's vacant, he's empty, he's absorbed. When you're absorbed in something, you, as they say, you lose yourself in that thing. And so I wanted to make that a trope. The person is losing his memory. But in the book, there is something strange. The person feels no anxiety at losing his memory. And this, I think, goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't want to overinterpret myself. That these bright thoughts are coming to me now. That, you know, the sense of the empty or the fragmentary is not a negative thing necessarily. So over here, the sense of him losing himself, which over here is literalized as his memory is going. He's not. It's not spelled out, but you know, he's not always aware of who he is.
Yeah.
Because he's becoming, he's recovering what formed him in fitful ways. This Cold War, this eternity he came from. So it causes no anxiety because it is a period of absorption, absorption in the sense of being absorbed by, but also he's being absorbed into. By the end of the novel, he probably thinks he belongs to East Berlin. You know, he opens his eyes. He's kind of fallen asleep, and a woman who is actually probably the cleaning lady he has conversations with without them ever understanding each other, because she knows no English, he knows no German, and they have fantastic conversations. And you know, this cleaning lady brings him up, and you know, he opens his eyes to see a familiar figure hanging up clothes to dry, and she is also unanxious, if there's such a word, and says that, oh, you've woken up, well, you know, etc., etc. And he feels that, okay, I have to now return to my life, which is a life of, as he says, paucity and small means, and I think it's going to always be like this until I die. And he has been absorbed into that history. He is now in East Berlin. So you know, to say that he went back in time, you know, he went back to the past. That's what's not going to work, because it is not that. Do you see what I'm saying? Create that, to say that he believed he was in East Berlin again. He believed the wall had never come down. It's not going to work. I'm sorry, but that's what I feel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for responding to our questions.
Thank you.
Yes, now.
Yeah,
I
we
think
better,
on time. Yeah, we did start a few minutes, a bit late, so
bit late.
we'll go on for 10, 15 more minutes. If
Yeah.
that's okay, if people have things to go to, that's quite all right. But we actually had some people submitted questions in
Yeah.
advance.
Yeah.
And, one of our own editors, Durga, who I believe is joining us from France on Zoom. So it's very late. Thank you, Durga. But if she'd like to share her question,
Yeah, must be late.
Yeah.
Durga, I will-
yeah, it's like,
So one.
it's like almost 3:00.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's 6 hours ahead.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very late.
Not
Yeah.
6:05, maybe.
I think the UK is 5.
No, the UK is
France?
4. No, the UK is 5.
UK is 5.
UK is
France
5.
is 6. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it's,
Messed up.
Yes, Durga, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, yes, feel free to share your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Thank you so much for the lovely reading of your book, and also like the very interesting conversation that sort of followed. And my question sort of buds off of some ideas you already mentioned about foreignness, representation, interpretation, and your conscious breaking of the mold of recounting, as you mentioned. So you're breaking away from an Indian recounting or a child's recounting of experiences, time, spaces, etc. So your writing sort of echoes with questions of familiarity, unfamiliarity, mystery, and encounters. And so I was curious to know about how these ideas of familiarity and mystery sort of converse or even contend with the term antiquity. And where does the other sort of position itself when you describe encounters, especially in your exhibition, the sweet shop owners of Calcutta, which sort of had a very interesting way of showing encounters. And following from that, what would your views be on the act of reading otherwise? And is reading otherwise even possible in the first place? So, yeah.
Is reading otherwise?
Mm.
Okay. Encounter. And no, the question was interesting, and I was thinking so busily when she was speaking that I forgot the first part of the question.
Would you like,
Am
I have the
am I
question
becoming
written
like
down.
this person in the text? But
Yeah, we
uh,
have Durga's question in writing, so in fact, maybe you
yeah,
can,
when you describe
yeah, it's a very rich question.
antiquity, that was the word.
That's the word, yeah.
Antiquity, that was the word. Yeah, by the way, did I use the word antiquity? I may have. I don't know.
I
Okay.
don't think in, no,
No.
in other writings.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's So Durga, that's a great question. Great questions, because there are a few questions over there. But antiquity, yeah. I feel that as writers, I'm being presumptuous. I'm calling myself, making myself part of we writers, that group. But I think again, antiquity, what we call antiquity, is seen as an encounter. It's not something that is reconstructed or revoked from the archive. So one doesn't believe. I don't believe in, I'm sure it could be great. It is great, in fact. But the whole act of historicism, of putting together something from the archive, of believing that something is there in the past, which you can reconstruct through the archive and master, and then thereby create something like a historical novel in the way it's understood today, is not something that I'm that interested in. I'm sure there are great examples of it, and examples of the way it could work, but I am not interested. I'm interested in an encounter with that thing which we call antiquity or the past, but encountering it as if it were where one were not putting it in that kind of in that sequence of things. And for me, it's a kind of ongoing discussion where or ongoing battle where you're on one side or another, and the battle has been going on from moment one, which we call antiquity, but which is already old, in the sense that these people are having conversations which have already happened, and they're intervening in those conversations. The Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, are interventions in existing conversations. They presuppose someone who we don't visualize or conceptualize, that is the default interlocutor from whom they're departing. In the same way, Durga, as let's say Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown by Virginia Woolf is a riposte to Bennett, and his kind of ideas of the realist novel at that point of time and character at that point of time, which we have now forgotten. We've forgotten now about Bennett's kind of position, which Woolf felt she must reply to. And we have forgotten because Bennett is us. Woolf is the not us, replying to ourselves. There's always this position going on of the interlocutor being there and merging into ourselves so that we don't feel the need to kind of reimagine that moment. So Eliot, Middleton Murray is whom he's addressing. We've forgotten about Middleton Murray. Maybe because many of Murray's positions, I might be being unfair to him, are us. We don't need to imagine him because he's already us. Eliot, when he says certain things about tradition or personality, it shocks us a little bit because that's the not us in us. This is a series of kind of conversations happening. What's that? Did I say something wrong?
Oh, no. No. That is interrupting.
You never know. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Very interesting. Yeah.
so that in that sense, I'm interested, Durga, I'm interested in the conversation and in recovering what we forget about the conversations, and also acknowledging the fact that we are always on the one side or the other of the conversation. We are that default person, or we have surprised ourselves, so often, the phases will occur when that surprise no longer occurs, and when those people who surprised us become canonized and are seen to be not us, but on the shelf, and or originary moments. This is where things began, and we look at, but it didn't begin there. It's an ongoing conversation. So in that sense, I take out the kind of sense that there is that period where it all began, and that's antiquity. What we're looking at instead are the conversations occurring through time and sometimes becoming domesticated, sometimes some part of them becoming forgotten, and then the shift again occurs, so that the conversation kind of, its dimensions open up again. But there is no original moment in the conversation. It's just that we don't know what preceded antiquity. It's only the latest kind of stage at that point of time. What was already ongoing. This, I would say, the same about the rag as a kind of construct. That it's an intervention in the idea of the mode, the scale, the melody. The rag is not a melody. The rag is not a scale. The rag is not a mode. So these things existed then. Song existed when the rag happened. Melody existed, the mode existed, but the rag was an intervention in saying that, no, we are not going to look at the mode, we're not going to look at a linear scale, we're going to look at interrelationships between notes. Two rags can have identical notes, but the interrelationships will, from rag to rag, will define what that rag is. And this is happening after. It's an intervention in our idea of melody and song. So the rag is not an originary moment. It again is a development. It's an annotation. So that was that. Sweet shop owners of Calcutta is something. Okay, I'll say one thing very quickly about sweet shop owners, since she brought it up in relationship to the idea of the encounter. So I did an art exhibition foolishly, because I hear that you don't need to be an artist nowadays to be one. So I did it, and it was kind of made up of three elements. One was these portraits, the photographs, which hang in sweet shops in Calcutta. Sweet shops in Calcutta are extremely important institutions. They might look kind of derelict, but they're very, very important. And they survive more or less as they always did from the 19th century onwards. And at the back on the wall, in some of these sweet shops, you'll see a grand looking man, framed portrait in there. And it occurs to you, the grand looking man doesn't look any different from the grand men who emerged with the so-called Bengal Renaissance, that the great writers, reformers, and scientists. I think, but he's a sweet shop owner, but he still has that sense of having emerged into a new world, and this giving him this kind of uniqueness, which we don't look at because it's, we've come to buy sweets and get out again. But if I were to kind of say, for instance, in North Calcutta, in Bhimnag, the picture of Bhimnag hangs side by side with Shama Prasad Mukherjee, who's a right-wing thinker. The kind of one of the founders of what led to the BJP. So he kind of, he's kind of there side by side with Bhimnag because he used to visit that sweet shop and buy sweets. I mean, you wouldn't know which one is the sweet shop owner and which one the historian and right-wing thinker, or the thinker, So something is going on with these people. So I took pictures of the pictures and I displayed them. And then there were two other sections in the exhibition, which one was called unusable gifts. These were a collection of gifts I'd got from people which I'd never been able to use, which I then displayed. And then there was one more section which I won't go into. But one of the things that I heard, I mean, not complaint, but a point was raised. You haven't told us which particular sweet shops these sweet shop owners are from. Yeah, I've mentioned them in the curator's note, but I have not mentioned next to each portrait which sweet shop. So the reason I did that was to avoid the sociological document. I wanted an encounter with, just as I had with the owner. So to step out of that documentation the mindset into the encounter is another thing that goes against historicism, the historical novel, ideas of archive leading to documentation, encounter it.
If anybody has a burning question, especially in the room.
Yeah, we'll take one in person.
Okay, sure.
Sure. Thanks so much for coming here. It's real pleasure. I love the book, and
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm only going to do once. But so one thing that was really interesting is you mentioned this sort of idea of an encounter with antiquity and sort of these existing conversations and departing from it made me think of like Virginia Woolf's idea, like the books continue each other. But I guess I was just really curious, like whether you were talking about the sort of the ongoing conversation and the encounter with antiquity, but there's also other like books or cinema that you feel that maybe Sojourn in particular is continuing with departing from.
Is in conversation with? Is that what you're asking?
Conversation with or were there any works that you felt were it's in part of the style?
Yeah. There must have been. I mean, I wasn't thinking of these other works, but retrospectively, I see that there are kind of works that I would want this to be neighbors with. So two works spring to mind. One is a story by Nirmal Verma called Terminal. So Nirmal Verma is a great short story writer in the Hindi language. Terminal is very interesting. So Terminal, so he lived in Prague in the 50s and 60s. So I think he moved to Prague in the late 50s, and he sort of exited around the time of the uprising and when the whole kind of political, the Soviets. So 68. What was it called? The Prague Spring? Yeah. So so he lived until then, and living there for whatever reason, I can't remember now. He was translating writers or what he was doing, what he was up to, because you could lead your life kind of doing weird things which you even yourself hadn't figured out as to why you were doing them. And there he was, and so that kind of course, must have reshaped his idea of narrative and stories. So Terminal, which is a relatively late story, but refers back to that period in a sense, emerges from the period. It was published, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 1992. So post fall of the Berlin Wall, is about a man who is involved with a woman, and they kind of have met by accident. She was waiting in front of an opera by Mozart, The Magic Flute, with 2 tickets in her hand. And later on, he says to her that, why did you have a second ticket? And because then, okay, so he goes to the opera looking for a ticket, and she says, I have an extra ticket, and that's how they meet. So later on, during a tram ride, where they're going to see a fortune teller who's going to say that your relationship is doomed. During that tram ride, or after it, he says, by the way, why did you have that second ticket? And she says that it was for you. There are times when I know that I'm going to meet somebody, that somebody is going to come into my life, and it was because of, I have intimations of whatever, meeting somebody, and it was for you. In the entirety of that story, I included that in my Picador and Vintage Book of Modern Indian Writing. I sometimes teach it to my students. I taught it here at Columbia when I did a kind of short stint here in 2002. And there is no mention of anybody being Indian or European or anything. There's no mention of it being Prague. There's no mention of it being East Europe. The only thing that kind of has that energy of strangeness in the translated version, which could pass off if you took away the name as a European story, is the name Nirmal Verma. And in the original, what would create the other frisson is the Hindi language. But otherwise, so these are ways, peculiar, obverse ways of transcending the universal, of not being universal, instead of making the text transparent, which you actually would if you laboriously said, man is Indian, you are Europe. Those are universals. Here we empty it of universals and make it actually quite opaque in a way, but not in a way that's incompatible with immediacy and the sensuous, which is the case here. Nirmal Verma, that's one, when I think about it. And the other is, I mean, I haven't really I wouldn't be able to elaborate on this Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire. Yeah. Which I see kind of, I don't see it as distinct from the city. I see it as part of the city. So it's not even as if I'm kind of looking at it as a film about Berlin. I see it as part of my experience of that city.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We do have to finish up, but there is one raised hand that's been waiting for 10 minutes. I think we'll, go with this and then wrap up. So Malathi Raghavan.
Yeah, Malati Raghavan.
Apologies. Yeah.
Hi, Amit. So before I listened to you yesterday and today, I was at your conversation with Piali also. Yeah.
Okay.
My question to you had been, why are there so few Indian protagonists situated in Eastern Europe, those kind of stories and those kind of novels and books? But then after I listened to you yesterday and today, where you're quite insistent that it doesn't matter that this protagonist is Indian. So I kind of, I'm trying to get my head wrapped around that because I have some Eastern European experience, and I feel like it is important because we don't see ourselves in those novels, and our experience is different. So I was just wondering if you had any comments about why do we not have many Indian protagonists in Eastern European stories? And I did not know about Nirmal Verma story, probably because I tend to read Indian literature in English.
Mhm. Great. So why aren't there more Indian protagonists featuring in narratives about Eastern Europe? And this is something, I don't have a kind of ready answer to, mainly because it's not something I've thought a lot about, and I haven't thought a lot about it because it's not fundamental to my kind of thought process at this point of time. But it's a worthwhile question, and certainly sure. I mean, what do Indians feel when they kind of go to East Europe? I mean, that kind of novel, that kind of narrative is definitely, a worthwhile project and an interesting one. When I say my protagonist is Indian, but that fact is not important, I mean, this is not a decision that I kind of premeditatedly took. It opened up certain things for me which wouldn't have been available to the narrative otherwise. It also allowed me to probe this very question as to why isn't it important? That is a question. It's not a kind of accidental kind of contingency that just happened by chance. It is a question. I think with Nirmal Verma also, it's a question. Why is this not important that I mention these kind of proper their names and backgrounds? The question becomes part of the experience. It is meant to open things up. It is meant, in fact, to open things up even to us as Indians, which don't get opened up if we keep talking about ourselves as Indian. I don't mean that we then transcend being Indian into being some world citizen type. That's not what I mean at all. But the terms of the discourse refuse to open things up. So it's in this sense that one wants to both create that disruption, to pose that question and be part of that process of opening things up, which over here is the absorption, the loss of memory, the formation referred to from time to time in that part of history, which has in different ways formed Susan, Terry Ann sitting over there, and in other ways has formed you. We are not going to get to it by the normal narrative routes. Or we'll only get to so much. So yeah, maybe that's why. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we will have to say goodbye to our Zoom participants, but
Yes.
I mean, if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to, stay and, converse with a few other people.
Sure.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That. And we'll also just share very briefly a little bit more information about Sojourn, which we also will send out via email. So to everyone who registered. For everyone who's local, it's available at Book Culture on 112th, which is where we all go for our course books at this time of the year. So there are some copies that are currently there, and it's also available as an ebook and on various other places. So this link is kind of the place to go in terms of finding either, this is at least what we got from your publisher. So I'm hoping this is the link to find either physical copies or an ebook. So you can read this.
So copies available at Book Culture. I'll go there right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's supposed to be 4 copies.
Yeah,
So it's like coveted. Like, I don't know who's gonna make it first.
At the other locations.
Okay.
As well. So 6 in total.
So there's 6.
6. Oh, fantastic. How many?
I know. Yeah, I don't know if we'll quite make it, but maybe we could, place an order. So that is just some more information about Sojourn. And we also just wanted to very briefly share that if you are an undergrad who writes about Asia, or if you know of undergrads or recent graduates who write about Asia and the Asian diaspora, whether that be research papers, poetry, prose, visual art, any kind of form of creative or academic work, we are open for submissions as a journal until September 23rd, and we would very much welcome submissions. We would welcome you to refer the journal to any students former students, especially for faculty in the room. So yeah, we wanted to share that, and also that we are hoping to continue these conversations and to continue with the speaker series into the fall semester. So you can just sort of follow the journal on the website or on its kind of various social media platforms to kind of keep up to date on that. We'll continue with this model of gathering in person on campus for people who can be there, and then of course having a Zoom feature so that people can join us from all over. So yeah,
Fantastic.
that's
That's great.
but yes, but thank you once again. And,
Thank you. I had a great time.
Yeah.